Okay, today we are, you'll be entertained for the July segment of Tuesdays with CKLS by Patty Collins to my right, Gail Santee, and myself. Our topic for today is conversations on intellectual freedom issues. We have chosen a few issues in the time that we have allowed to cover some topics that we usually don't have time to do. And we know that they oftentimes cause our librarians a lot of problems. We came to this conclusion over the past few months when all of us were receiving phone calls and emails about issues such as these. So I'm going to just go over them and then we'll launch into it. So we're going to be covering core values of librarianship, censorship and collection development, meeting rooms, displays, and bulletin boards. Okay, so I'm going to get right to this here. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, our topic is conversations on intellectual freedom. And the first question you might say, well, what brought the three of you to the conclusion that you're passionate about this? And I'll just start because I've got the mic right now. I was joining the library business and got involved in my coursework and just visiting the different libraries. I noticed the vast variety of patrons that we serve and that their needs are very different. And it was really easy to see that it's sometimes as you're forming your libraries and you're building your collections, you may not necessarily look at things quite as globally as you should. So I got very interested in this, and one of the classes that I took as I was leaving my coursework, it was the very last one, was a course on intellectual freedom. And I had to think and talk about all kinds of things, from meeting rooms and displays and all the things that I actually never even considered. So that's my story. So Patty?
Good afternoon. Where I came to intellectual freedom was standing up at the front desk one day many, many years ago. Actually, it'll be 25 very shortly. And this book landed on the desk. A patron was quite angry. I had been a librarian. Actually, I don't even think I was the department head yet for about 2 months. This landed on the front desk, and somebody says, and if you can see the title, it is called Everyone Poops. And they said eloquently, this is a piece of crap. It needs to be removed from your library. And luckily, I had wonderful supervisors and great mentors to help me through my first challenge. And it went all the way through, does the book need to be removed? And so this started me to realize that you don't always know what's on your shelf, and that the items that are there, someone can find an objection with. And so that leads me to today.
What about you, Gail?
In one of my previous lives, I was in the Army. I was a Russian and German translator, and I lived in Berlin, and my primary work was to put a stop to the East Bloc, communism, East Germany, Soviet Union, and in that work, I became very familiar with what an entire and total lack of intellectual freedom looks like, and it leads to a country that is submissive and a country that you just know nothing. And I became very passionate about it, and like Margie, in one of my courses, I studied intellectual freedom, and I was we did a court. It always reminds me of Judge Judy, who I don't know who it is, but I guess I know. I don't watch TV. And I needed to defend what was, we classified it as hate speech, and I needed to defend that. And there was a whole bunch of interesting information on there. So I've got a long and storied history like my colleagues.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wish was this intellectual freedom class that I took, instead of it being the last class I took, I wish it would have been the first one, because I talked with different librarians from all over the country, and it really quickly brought home the fact that me living in the Middle West, thinking I'm leaning more liberal, I probably am tainted a little bit by where I live, where I had colleagues that were living in Portland, that were in the LGBTQ community. I worked with people that were probably from Southern Missouri, who are a little bit more conservative. So yeah, I think, the more people you're exposed to, it makes you broaden your point of view. So, all right, well, without further ado, we'll move forward. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, because I know that you librarians constantly hear the reference to how the mission of the library world is to defend the First and the Fourth Amendments of the Constitution. And some new to the field may not really know where this comes from, and some seasoned librarians may need to remember where this comes from. So here's a little brief history lesson for you. So we all know that the Bill of Rights was created because our forefathers, in their infinite wisdom, did not feel that the Constitution went far enough. It disenfranchised women, it disenfranchised people of color. So in order to protect the citizens of the United States from the potential overreaching arm of the government and a tyrannous majority, which would be one particular persuasion being in charge of everything, from interfering in the citizenry, the Bill of Rights was born. We have to thank James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who both agreed that the best defense from government interference is an educated citizenry. Freedom to inquire, freedom of speech are essential for the search of truth. And when we talk about searching for truth, we are looking for emerging ideas that are available for all people to examine and discuss. The forum of ideas must be free and unrestricted, and most of all, not restricted by the government or the actions of the government. So what does that mean for a public library? Well, I'm not sure if everyone remembers this, but as a government agency, the public library, which you are, a tax-funded agency, you need to subscribe and operate within the legislative purpose. Now, this gets a little confusing because we all have to, so a lot of people are from different states. So if you take that away and just concentrate on the library as a government agency, remember that the core mission for the library, and it's the only agency in the government that has this, is it includes both the private and the public purpose of the Bill of Rights. So this exists for a number of reasons. You're primarily there to provide access to information on all subjects, from all points of view, to all people who live in the geographic area served by the library, regardless of their race, their nationality, the ethnic origin, religion, income, age, or any other arbitrary classification. The individual library user exercises free choice as to whether he or she seeks information from the library materials for educational, recreational, informational, cultural, political, or other reasons, whatever they choose. So the public library is the source for information and knowledge necessary for a strong democracy. So one of the highest duties of a library board and the librarian that serves with that board is to protect and nurture the constitutional system that was put in place by our forefathers. So, we have to remember we're tax-funded entities, and so that's where this whole umbrella of you becoming a government agency is born. So we're going to go ahead now and look at these core values that our American Library Association subscribes to us. And I think this little table sums it up really easily. And you can always go back and refer to this. I have this slide presentation in the folder that Mary Beth provided the link to. So one of the first core values that we have is access. And under that umbrella is confidentiality, privacy, democracy, and what have you. I'm not going to go through it because I know we want to get right to these crucial conversations. But you can see from the list that we are charged with a great responsibility. So here, under the umbrella of intellectual freedom, we are fortunate enough to have the American Library Association, who is in our corner. We have so many documents, so many resources that they provide for us. You don't necessarily have to be a member because it is there for your access. But I would certainly encourage you to join if you're not. And if you're not, that's certainly your choice. But if you're not a member, why should you promote and defend intellectual freedom? Well, it's your job. It's what you're charged to do by being a librarian. Here's some interesting information about the Library Bill of Rights. It was first adopted in June 19th of '39. And what I find interesting is what was happening in the world in the 30s. If you look at the slide here, all kinds of things were happening in our world. We had a lot of, well, I'm not going to read it because, again, I want to get to the meat of our conversation, but the world was in turmoil at the time. So to have the Library Bill of Rights charge us as librarians with protecting people's freedom of speech and freedom to access information was quite telling. And if you look across the slide at the bottom, the dates that it was amended, and think back in history, those things, there are very important things happening during those years as well. So as a little homework, go ahead and check that out if you don't remember your history, and you'll understand why the library was amended. And as a sidebar, we don't have a slide to this, but we're going to talk about it. They just amended one of the meeting room policy, or rather the meeting room topic at the recent ALA meeting, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, so here we go. When we're talking about the things that, such as meeting rooms, your bulletin boards, censorship, etc., we always come down to policy versus procedure. Your best defense as a librarian is to have policy that describes exactly how your particular institution handles certain things. For instance, meeting rooms, how they're used. What is your policy on, let's say, patrons? What is a patron behavior policy? That's a really good one. Those are things that if you don't have them, we have a lot of examples that we can share with you. And then you look at the procedure. So now I've written the policy and it's there in its scope, but then what is the procedure for the people that are at the front line to enforce that policy? I do have a document in that folder that describes exactly the difference. So if you need some help defining what a policy is and a procedure, please go ahead and access that and take a look. I think it's a good thing to keep on hand if you're ever confused by the difference between the two. So basically, it always comes back to policy. So I'm going to defer this over to Patty now.
So one of the things that we're often guilty of, and standing at the front desk, especially when we're challenged, is we immediately go for what we think is going to be the thing that's going to shut down that difficult conversation. And every one of us has done it. We're all guilty of it. But the automatic response is, oh, that's our policy, we can't do that. And so when we say it always goes back to policy, a lot of the activities that we do in the course of our day are actual procedural. So for example, the policy says that you can check out 5 DVDs on a card for a period of 2 weeks. That's what the policy says. The procedure is actually how the person at the circulation desk or at the service desk is actually going through that process. So it may say, the policy may say you have to have a library card, or the policy may say that a form of identification is acceptable. So on the procedural side, you have to decide, is an ID and a library card, are they the same thing? Interpretation of the policy, and we can help you do that. And then it's the actual checking out of the books is the procedure piece. Well, when we're stuck with someone dropping an item in our lap and saying you need to get rid of this, there needs to be a procedure or a policy that guides us through that process, and then procedurally what we need to do. And so it's very scary when you're standing at that front desk and somebody is challenging you. We immediately go, it's not our policy, I can't do that. And so when we misguide and misuse the word policy, we're just asking for someone to say, okay, prove it. And then we've backed ourselves into a corner. And ultimately, if we cannot prove it, we lose credibility with that patron and any patron who might be listening to that conversation. Because in terms of things like privacy and confidentiality, the conversation that we have with the patron over the desk is not just being heard by that patron, it's being heard by all of those in the rest of the room. So policy versus procedure is a difficult one, and we'll be glad to go into that further with you.
Do you want to weigh in on any of this?
Y'all are doing a great job.
All right. So our first scenario, Patty.
Okay. This board member chooses that recommends that you remove a certain title from the library. What do you do? Well, the first issue is you might be a one-person library, or you might be a multi-person library, and this person is a position of power. And so that's just flat scary. We completely get that. Where do you go with this? If you have, and hopefully you do, and if you don't, Margie and Gail and I are going to make sure you do, have a policy in place for what you do with a challenge, because it doesn't matter where this challenge is coming from. It could be the mayor, it could be the president. That challenge is coming from someone, and you have to have a policy for that. And then likely you have something called a reconsideration policy or a challenge policy, but it basically goes through a list of activities that the person presenting the challenge, whether it's self-reported or reporting for a group, they have to go through a series of steps. And one of those questions on that sheet is, have you read the entire thing? And another question is, what do you specifically object to? And so it gives you the basis for what it is, but plainly, and we'll be very honest with you, that a lot of the self-reported challenges start off with, this is a bad book and you need to get rid of it. And it may just be, I just want to be heard. But if it moves to that paper form, then they have to sign their name and write what they specifically object to. And that gets a little tricky, because we think of, what are we comfortable signing our name to? So we want to hear from you. Does anybody out there have a gut feeling of what you do in this situation?
I would weigh in, and I would say that if you have a really good policy in place, everybody on staff needs to be trained on that. The director needs to know it really well, and your board also needs to know it. That's important, because then that helps you know what your starting place is.
And about people just wanting to get it off their chest is probably the first thing that happens. Recently, something was shared with me. It was just a patron that was writing about materials that she saw in a library. And actually, it was kind of based on the tax funding, and she kind of didn't have her story straight, and she didn't have her information straight. So maybe sometimes, too, if we can educate our public about how the library is actually funded, this might take some of that sting away. But anyway, I think it speaks to the fact that there's a little bit more homework that you need to do, and you need to remain calm. That's the first thing I think that's
absolutely.
And there's a comment in the chat that says, I'm glad that you touched on the ones that just want to be heard. And I think that's a lot of people, whether it's about a banned book or just an issue at the library. Sometimes they just want to be heard.
Yeah. I think in the first half of this year, I've had 3 concerned patrons talk to me about different materials, and they just wanted to be heard. They needed to know our stance and our response on things, and they did not move to challenge. They were very happy with the conversation.
The continuation of the comment in the chat is there was a preacher's wife who questioned several items, but was happy to leave a comment in Koha on the online catalog. So I think that, you know, she felt like she was heard and she felt like she could share her opinion with others too.
Paired with this, with the reconsideration policy, in your list of policies, you should also have a collection development policy. And basically that guides you as the selector for materials for the library. And I know that you are all educated into what your community needs, and you're educated into what you're purchasing. Do you have to read every book in your library? Absolutely not. That's not possible. But having a good idea of what's been purchased will help you on the other end, because if it does go through the process, then you need to be able to have review sources and be able to defend why this item is here. And that leads me to just, in the chat earlier, I put a note to ALA's advocacy page. If you get into a challenge situation, if someone is complaining and you're concerned, your first call should be to CKLS. And then we will help you go through the steps and provide you some guidance. But when it's out of our hands, we go to ALA. We pull out the big guns, because they've been through this process and they do provide support and defense to libraries that are in these situations. So know that you are not alone in this process.
Yeah, if you've ever gone to the Office of Intellectual Freedom website for ALA, you'll notice that they have specific people assigned to certain tasks. So so for instance, there's someone that covers meeting rooms, bulletin boards, and what have you. There's someone that covers censorship and collection development. So you can imagine that these people are well versed. Not only do they know about the subject, but they also know all the court cases involving it and can guide you. They can really guide you. So I would encourage you to please take time to look at their site. And I'm going to give a plug to the Intellectual Freedom Guide that I wrote. I have all kinds of resources for you there. And if you're new to intellectual freedom, there's a video on the first page that explains all about intellectual freedom. And I really would encourage you to take the time to watch it. I learned a lot, you know, and it was presented by, not only is she a librarian, but she's also an attorney. So anyway. We'll go to our next topic. Oops. Sorry, there we go. So our next scenario, and this is a real scenario, it's not made up. A previous librarian kept books such as What's Happening to My Body and The Illustrated Guide to Sex behind the desk. So what do you do?
Put them in the collection. When you hide things behind the desk, that is censorship. When you choose not to purchase certain titles for your collection because you think they're going to be controversial, or they're going to stir up trouble, the same wording there, you're self-censoring before you even give your patrons a chance. What's Happening to My Body is most often, I'd bet, the most stolen title in libraries from the juvenile collection, and that's because the information in it is so critical. It might not be a previous librarian. It might be a current staff member who says, oh, this Sports Illustrated with the swimsuits just a little too racy. We better keep it back here. We don't want anybody to get titillated in the library. It is not your responsibility to choose what your patrons will and will not read. That is their sole responsibility, no matter their age.
I just want to add a quick little story. My grandparents were very offended by a book that was in my hometown library, and I was the librarian on duty at the time. And they were offended because it had a curse word in there. It was the GD curse word, and they wanted it taken out. And I said, you have every right to be offended by this book, but you do not have the right to tell people what they can read. And when I said it like that, they were like, that makes sense. Okay. And then they were glad that I heard them out and was respectful for them, but also that I made my position clear as well.
And I would say I'm not going to call them canned statements, but having statements like that written down and you practice those so that you become comfortable with them, helps you speak in confidence to these sensitive issues.
Gail, I agree. Scripted responses are key. There's a reason that's what, I'm going to use the Southwest Airlines example I've used a lot, but if you're intoxicated and planning to board a plane, Southwest response is, I'm sorry, you won't be flying with us today. But if you've ever been in line, you've heard that. You know exactly what's happening, but that response saves you. The intellectual freedom things just pop up all over the place, and we read a lot of blogs and follow a lot of Facebook posts. And just last night, I think Margie sent this one to us. A library outside of Detroit, somebody was hiding the 50 Shades of Grey movies, not the books. They were hiding the movies. It happened last summer. It happened again this summer. So sometimes they repeat. People don't go away always. And they were hiding the movies. So the library's response was they took everything, once they found all these things and replaced some others, they took everything that might be considered objectionable and put all these items out on display and says someone is hiding these materials from you. They've made a decision for you. So we as the library stand against censorship and put up a display of these materials. And of course, these items are being checked out. A few of the comments have been very supportive. A couple of people have the why would they ever do that kind of idea, but that's kind of these stories are out there, and it's key when you're stuck in that process. If you are the library that has to deal with someone moving through the process, it's key to save your paperwork, because this group might not go away, or this person might not go away. Mary Beth gave an example of her grandparents. She was respectful, answered the question. In my library life, if a patron made a complaint, that probably wasn't going to be the only one. And so I already had my the little hairs on the back of my neck were standing up a little bit. And yes, I was perhaps in the prepared, not defensive, but prepared mode, because what were they going to bring me next? And this often happens when a group brings an issue to a re-challenge. So in the case, or it might be a church group, a civic group, someone representing a group of people, and they might go quiet, but they don't necessarily go away. So you need to keep that
right. And one of the ways that you should keep those is those should be in your report to the board. If a patron says, hey, I think this book should be removed, that should be in your report as a library director to the board. You're not going to mention the patron's name, but you're going to mention the title. And if you receive paperwork, your board needs to be very aware of that. They're your best advocates in the community.
Okay, well, yeah, I think we've all had some really interesting experiences, and censorship is something that we really need to be careful about. So we'll be happy to entertain any other questions and what have you. And if you do have some experiences, please share them with us, because we are collecting these, because we do take this show on the road, so to speak. So I'm always intrigued by what everybody else comes across with. So, okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide. All right, so this goes along with censorship. It's how do you develop your collection? And here are some things that we are all faced with. Back to my history lesson, you're in charge of developing a collection for everyone with all kinds of interests, regardless of their sex, their color, their income, etc. So you've been awarded a large grant to purchase young adult books for the library. Several teen patrons requested LGBTQ titles in the past. What do you do? All right, Patty, I'm going to give this.
Yeah, buy them books. They're coming to you. That's bravery in its own part. They're coming to you, telling you what they want. Now, if this is an area that you're uncomfortable with, you have all kinds of review sources. You have CKLS. You're not alone again. But ask them what they want. They're probably going to have titles in mind. And one of the keys to your collection development is always a balanced collection. So when you look, I have lots of books that show the nuclear family of mom and dad and 3.2 kids and a dog, and that's great. But do I have anything that shows there's two moms? Or do I have anything that shows a single parent? Do I have anything that shows someone that's not a white nuclear family? And so even though you think that I'm in the middle of rural Kansas and these things don't apply to me, you don't know your community. You think you do. But likely the community member who doesn't feel like there are things for them at the library is the person that's not walking in the door. It's our job to make sure that those things are there. I know you can do this. I know it's scary. But you buy them books, and if you don't know where to start, you call us and we'll help you through that process.
Yeah, I think
we chose this to be a grant purchase and not part of your regular everyday budgetary line items, because a grant is like candy money. Your regular budgetary items, when you're talking about building a balanced collection, it's trickier to do, because if you only have $500 to $1,000 a year to purchase titles, and hardbacks are run about $25 to $35 each, you're going to come up against what you feel are financial barriers to building a balanced collection. And that's where knowing your resources beyond your walls come in. That's where knowing that if there's a title that someone is interested in, you can look in Koha and see others in the series, other books like this, and you can request those from other libraries within Pathfinder, or you can request them on Share It. That's the best thing that you can do for your patrons.
So I'm just going to throw this in here because I know some of this makes people uncomfortable. And there's these two things in the library world that we have to reconcile. One is your moral conviction and what you believe outside of the walls of the library. And then there's the ethical part of this. So we're not asking you to cross the barrier of what you morally believe, but that you are charged with the ethical responsibility of building a balanced collection. I may not necessarily believe that LGBTQ lifestyles are honorable for me, or I think that maybe I have a problem with that. But that doesn't give me the right then to not develop a collection because of my belief. I have an ethical responsibility as a librarian to provide all sides. And I just always want you to be mindful of that. You know, we live in a very charged political climate right now. And, you know, looking and taking this one step further, we weed a lot of libraries, we walk through. It's always disheartening for me to walk through the nonfiction and see one-sided books on politics. I think we owe it to our patrons to have all sides. So, you know, think about that as you are developing your collection.
I have a comment from the chat. It says, thank you for mentioning the financial constraints. That was going to be one of my questions. So
good.
Already answering questions before they ask them.
Woohoo. All right. So in the interest of time, we'll go on here. All right. Collection development, movie ratings. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Patty.
I would chime in first and say that this just happened in my library last week.
Do tell, Gail.
Okay, well, in fact, one of the top 10 most challenged books for, let me get to that thing, for 2017 is 13 Reasons. It was the top challenged item, and that was the book. It has now come out in movies, and one of my lovely concerned citizens in Great Bend had just heard someone talk about that series that teens were watching that on Netflix, and they were in fact taking the instruction on suicide there, and they were taking their own lives. And of course, as a compassionate human being, I'm not going to laugh that off. That is very serious to me, because teen suicide and suicide in general is something we all should take very seriously. However, my professional ethics tell me that it is not my responsibility as the librarian to act as that teen's parent. It is that teen's parent's child. Oh, it is the teen's parent's responsibility to keep track of what the child is reading or watching, and to have those conversations at home with the child. My very special concerned patron was also a retired school teacher, and so I needed to explain to her the difference in society, the roles that library play versus school. Schools act as parents in absentia. Libraries do not. We are not charged with that. Schools are responsible for those children when they're in their care. Librarians are not. I was able to explain the information that is on this slide here, and also explained that libraries who have rated movies R and prevented juveniles from borrowing those movies have been taken to court and have lost that suit. How's that? A real life example just last week.
And that's what intellectual freedom is, an ever-living situation for libraries. Just a little bit of history. The Motion Picture Association of America is who has created the film rating system. This is a voluntary rating. Movies can choose to not be rated. They do have to go through a process. The MPAA rating system that we know today is only 50 years old. If you know anything about film history, you've heard of the Hays Code, and that was a little self-imposed by the movie industry in order to get things played in theaters, because they wanted to be able to get to play in small town theaters. So the Hays Code was how they did their own censoring of what was happening out there. But for example, this thing is only 50 years old. So some movies that came out before or chose not to be rated before the rating system became a generally accepted process. For example, the Bonnie and Clyde movie, and it was just right before this date, that was the Warren Beatty version. It's actually not rated at all. By the system that would have been in place at that time, it actually would have been rated X because of the amount of violence and the amount of language in it. It would have passed the R because there's so many things that can happen for it to be an R, and it would have passed R at that point. So again, just to let you know, there could be things on your shelves that don't have ratings on them at all, that you might not be aware of, and that's exactly how I found it out, because somebody came and brought Bonnie and Clyde to me, and then that rating system has changed over the years. It started off with G, which is your general audience, and that's what we consider our safe stuff. And then it's now we call it PG or PG-13, but when it first came out, it was called M for mature. So mature came before R, and then X was the worst, and now X is now what we equate with NC-17. But again, this is a complete choice for these film houses to have their movies rated. As Gail stated, the situation with children being prevented from checking out materials, it creates a challenge. I will share, again, personal experience. I was a children's librarian in a fairly decent-sized public library when a board member made a decision to approach the board with putting in the policy that says no children under the age of 13 can check out movies that are PG-13 or higher. We did not keep birth dates. We did not keep social security cards. We just barely kept an address on our patrons because we didn't want anything that would get back on them. So we had no way of keeping control of that. So basically, if you looked younger than that, you didn't get the movie because we followed the policy. Now, again, back to that ethical decisions collide. Because my policy said I needed to make sure no child checked out that item, I had to follow that policy because I wanted to have a job. However, I disagreed with it, but I had to disagree quietly, and I had to do my job.
Marilyn from Ray Hobson asked a question. She said, and I find this is quite common in CKLS area, their library has a form when they apply for a library card, and the parents fill out the form as to what ratings they want the child to be able to check out for movies and games. They check what is acceptable to them, and then they sign it. Is this okay? Really, it is not. Because you might have a substitute librarian in one day, and that child might come in and borrow a PG-13 or R-rated movie. Your substitute librarian did not know. The parent's going to come to you furious, and that's going to be the least of your worries. No, it is not okay. You cannot act as the parent in loco parentis. It's locus parentis. I always say loco. Act as the crazy parent. Sorry. You do not act as the parent when the parent is not present.
Okay. Right. Again, if you have any other questions about movie ratings, etc., and also movie license, please send them our way because we have a lot of information we can share with you. Okay. All right, this brings us to our next topic, which is actually quite timely, meeting rooms and exhibit spaces. And we're also going to throw bulletin boards in there as well. So here's the scenario. A local service organization wants to use the library meeting room to host a fundraiser event. What do you do? Has this happened to anyone recently?
There is a follow-up comment from Marilyn
okay.
about the movie and checking out. It says, but we have a setting on Koha that doesn't let certain ages check out R-rated movies.
A setting.
I will mention that there's been some procedural changes here at CKLS recently, probably within the last 3 years, having the situation where libraries can be sued for this situation has caused us to be more cautious. And in the CKLS technical services, there were several libraries that had R or PG ratings that we would put on their spine label. As a result of this recent action, we're no longer putting any ratings on spine labels. And I think that the reason why Koha has that setting there is because that is a setting from 2009, which has not had the current events recently.
I would also add that, remember, Koha is an open source integrated library system. It's not vendor specific. Koha is designed for academic librarians, law librarians, librarians who keep track of information in vineyards, and school librarians. Just because a setting is there for another type of library doesn't mean it's appropriate for us. And these are things that we should be looking at now. These are things that you should be discussing with your board, and the policy should be that the parents decide what the children checks out. The parents need to be responsible for that. And then the procedure would be that you would contact one of the Pathfinder managers and say, hey, my board has set this policy in place, and we want to have that tick removed or changed in Koha because it violates our policy.
Right.
Does that help?
That does help. She responds that we need to have this removed. It was put on when we were automated when I started. So yes, every library, when they come onto Koha, they get to pick their rules. And so if you had that rule or that policy, we would set it up that way. So that's why that exists, is that was how your policies were set up. So that's how we set up the circulation rules. I think it's a good time to point out that nothing is permanent or stationary. So just because it worked a few years ago doesn't mean that it's still the right path for your library at this point. So I think it's always a good idea to just keep your circulation rules in mind and see if it's time to be revisited. Do you still need to limit your movies to 2 at a time for 7 days, or can you check out your movies for longer now? There's other things to consider, not just who can check out a rated R movie.
Okay, I'll wait a couple minutes to see if there's any more comments before we charge on. Yeah, I think we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but we'll save that for another time. Right, so meeting rooms and exhibit spaces, and I'm going to throw in bulletin boards. Again, here's the scenario. First of all, think about, do you have a meeting room and exhibit space policy? I'm going to go ahead and we'll talk about this one, and then I will share with you something that was asked to me. I've had two things this past year that are questions about the use of space. So what do you think? Is it okay for a organization to host a fundraising event in your library?
I think this is Patty. I think the key word here is fundraiser. Mm-hmm. And if your meeting room policy or your library policy does not allow for any fundraising of any type beyond the scope of the library, then this answer is very clear. Can this local organization meet for some other purpose? By all means, if that fits into the policy. But the fundraiser puts this in a difficult situation. So to take this on the other side, so what if the local plumber has come to do a presentation for you, say a summer library program where he's going to teach you how to fix the toilet in 3 easy steps, and he's doing a program for you? What does that do to the fact that he is actually a person who is a for-profit business? What does that do to the meeting room use policy? Thoughts?
You know, I kind of look at this as though if you went into the local coffee shop and set out your things to sell on the table, would they allow you to do that? You know, you're not renting the space. They're not gaining anything from that. So I think we have to be really, really careful about this in terms of what we do with our space. I know there's a lot of policies out there. I can think of one that I found that I actually put on the LibGuide. It does talk about having the space available that libraries can charge a fee. But I really think this is something you need to think long and hard on. You need to talk with the people that you work with and kind of think about how you want your space to be used. One of the things that I was asked this year, a librarian contacted me, unbeknownst to her, there was a group that had signed up to use the room probably weekly, or I'm not sure the time frame, but a patron came to her and asked where the drug testing was taking place. And she was flabbergasted. She said, like, what drug testing? She was, well, the school told me that, you know, I could come and bring my grandson here for a drug test. Well, it comes to find out that the group that was using the meeting room, it sounded like it was some sort of a nonprofit help organization for people that were coming off of maybe an addiction issue. But what it really was a group that people have to pay a fee to go and pass a drug test for certain things. So for instance, they've been convicted of like a crime or what have you. And so she had no clue that this was going on. And you know, those groups charge quite a bit of money to conduct that drug testing. So, you know, I just guided her towards, she had no meeting policy, and also being the way where their meeting room was, it was out of the line of sight. So I never have gotten back with her to see if they wrote a policy, but you need to be really aware of what the people that are using your meeting rooms are doing. So
I think also there are a couple of key things in this slide. In this instance, it's a local service organization. One of the things that the new meeting room policy talks about is if you allow this group in, will you allow that group? Well, this might just be the optimists doing a fundraiser. But what if the KKK wants to use the room for a fundraiser next? When you have a very poorly written meeting room, bulletin boards, and exhibit spaces policy, you open yourself up for all kinds of problems.
There's a question in chat. Are there generally accepted best practices for use of spaces by nonprofit and for-profit organizations, or is it up to the individual libraries to determine their policies? I think it's always to say that it's always up to the individual library to determine their policies. But there are always sources of what ALA supports and what they recommend. So there's always this, go to that site as well. So I think the answer to the question is yes and yes. So Gail is typing in there, from the recent ALA meeting room use guidelines, if a library allows charities, nonprofits, and sports organizations to discuss their activities in library meeting rooms, then the library cannot exclude religious, social, civic, partisan, political, or hate groups from discussing their activities in the same facilities. So again, it's all that equal access.
Michael, one of the things that when a library director is aware that their library lacks policies on meeting rooms and any kind of policy in general, the librarian will work with the board and help the board become aware of this. There may be a committee that does research. Sometimes it's the librarian doing research and bringing it to the board and saying, here, this is what we need. Here are some examples. Pick one and let's customize it. But generally, there are industry standards and guidelines for policies.
This is Patty. In my former library life, we had a similar situation. We had a group. On the piece of paper it said PFLAG, which stands for Parents of Lesbian and Gays. And as long as it was written like that on the form, there didn't seem to be any concern. But actually, the concern came from one of the people working the circulation desk when she found out what that group stood for, and she says, oh, they shouldn't be in our meeting room. So again, we have that clash of personal and professional ethics. But when I responded to her, I said, didn't just last Sunday your church use the library meeting room when your church had a situation with their building? Didn't you use it for church services? Oh, well, that doesn't matter, was her response. So, and speaking in response to Gail's meeting room use guidelines from ALA, PFLAG had just as much, by our policy, just as much opportunity to use that room as did ABC Church. And that was really hard for this particular person to rally with. And we heard it from more than one person because she went to her church and explained who else was using the meeting room.
Yeah, so we really haven't even talked about, when we create exhibits or our bulletin boards, but take it to that level too. I mean, if you're, going to create an exhibit that the world is flat, then you need to offer the other side of the exhibit, the books that talk about it being round. And I'm using that example because that's, just a non-inflammatory example.
Evolution, did you?
Yeah, I didn't want to go to evolution or
safe. It's
whatever.
safe.
But it is something to think about. It goes back to all sides. Again, your bulletin boards. You don't have the right to go up and pull off the flyer for a group that you are morally opposed to. If you're going to have a bulletin board that's open, and I'm talking about those that are open for the public to come in and display, not your bulletin board about what's coming up next week. But these are the ones that people walk in and they put flyers on. If it's there for the public, it's there for everyone. And we don't have the right to censor that information, just like we don't have the right to censor the things that we add to our collection. So in the interest of time, we're gonna go ahead and move on here. Here we go. We've got the Virginia White Pride Group wants to use the library meeting room and put flyers up on the library bulletin board. What do you do? The recent statement from the ALA about meeting rooms talks exactly about hate speech and hate crimes. There is a link to all this information in the LibGuide. It's the updated version. It talks specifically about the stance that ALA takes on this. And one of the things that Patty and I were visiting about yesterday, and I'd never thought about, and I certainly haven't seen in our libraries, is a disclaimer that's outside the meeting rooms that the library, while it does allow groups such as this to use the library meeting room, we do not subscribe to the comments or the opinions of those using the library. So let's see. Oh, okay. So basically in this document, it's very interesting because we have to remember that the definition of hate speech, it does not have a legal definition under U.S. law, just as there's no definition of rudeness or evil ideas or unpatriotic thoughts. But generally, hate speech is any form of expression through which speakers intend to vilify, humiliate, or incite hatred against a group or class of persons. There are countless examples of, I read an example, a court case that was overturned or set aside was a civil judgment against the Westboro Baptist Church. Because while what they did when they were protesting at funerals and naming, saying disparaging things about the person that had passed or LGBT people, that was freedom of speech. And we as librarians cannot act as judge and jury on that. However, we take that a step further, we have to consider when that speech turns into crime. And this is really interesting because I know that we talk about so let's just talk about this. A hate crime is a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Hate crimes, which can also encompass color, national origin, are overt acts that include violence against persons or property, violation of civil rights, conspiracy, or certain true threats or acts of intimidation. The Supreme Court has upheld laws that criminalize these acts or impose a harsher punishment when it can be proven that the defendant targeted the victim because of the victim's race, ethnicity, identity, or beliefs. So the library, how this fits in for us, we are sanctuary spaces for the First Amendment. So for us, we really can't there's no hate speech exception in the First Amendment, so that's where we fit in here. So, be mindful of that. And one of the really cool things in this document, and I encourage you to go look at it in its entirety, hate speech stops being just speech and becomes conduct when it targets a particular individual and includes behavior that interferes with the patron's ability to use the library. So direct action plus hate speech equals hateful conduct. So this is when a great policy on patron conduct is really important for you to include in your library. So I'm sure we'll have some comment about this.
We realize that this is can make you very, very uncomfortable. Although many of us are from very small towns, and I was the small town that hid the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, so I completely get it. We might be from small towns now. We might be from small towns where we were born and bred, but we work every day to protect our children and ultimately our patrons as librarians. And so we know how difficult and uncomfortable this whole process is, but we know that by you attending today, you are looking at what those principles of librarianship are, and that you're doing your very, very best to defend those principles and to try to make every person feel welcome and every item that you put on the shelf worthy of them. And we appreciate your hard work.
Okay. All right, so we're about an hour into this, so we're going to talk with you about a little homework. And if you have any more comments, we'll be happy to keep going. But I know a lot of you, we've committed to keeping this about an hour. So please send us your intellectual freedom questions and concerns for future talks. We know that this is an area that we need to spend more time with. And every time we sit down or, we look at something, we read in the paper, I think it's becoming more common. And we want to have you share your experiences with us because you're out there in the front line and you have a very rich experiences that I think are certainly worth us exploring and have a lot of value when we go and talk with other libraries about this. So, please do a little homework, do a little research, take some time to look at the LibGuide. It may bring up some questions in your mind, or just go on the ALA website and look at some of the things that they have to offer.
Before we go, does anybody know what the historically most challenged book is? Gail knows. And Mary Beth knows. Okay, let's get somebody who's not sitting in a CKLS office to answer this question. I know somebody's out there. The top 10 list of ALA most challenged books was in the chat earlier, and it's challenged by year. Historically, in the top 100, the Holy Bible shows up. Most recently, it was number 6 in 2015. So it goes through a circle and it keeps showing up. Just like some of those that you know. You wouldn't put Harry Potter and the Holy Bible in the same sentence generally, but on the ALA challenge list, they're often together. And again, this whole thing is very, very uncomfortable. And we always feel like we're going to do the wrong thing. But we assure you that education is the first step to you being able to serve your patrons in the best way.
Yeah, and there's nothing harder than standing in front of a person who's unhappy or incensed and trying to remain calm. And that's the first thing to do. Take a deep breath, understand they're coming in with something else that may be going on in their life, something that maybe this topic has set them off, or this book or this movie. So always remain calm and always know that we have your back. So any of us, all your consultants are here for you. It doesn't necessarily need to be Gail, Patty, or myself. You've got Crystal, Mary Beth, Kathy, Ron, Christy Schneider. We're here. So anyway. All right.
I like that, Patty. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, our next Tuesday talk will be in August. I'll give you the date here.
August 21st.
Okay, August 21st. Thank you, Mary Beth. So have a good week and send us your questions. Thank you very much for attending.
Have a